The Thanksgiving table stretched before me, a beautiful scene of autumn colors and polished silver that hid the ugly truth festering beneath our family's surface. I had spent all morning in my small kitchen, carefully crafting my famous apple cranberry pie, the one my late husband Arthur had always claimed was better than any fancy bakery's creation. My hands trembled slightly as I set the golden brown pie on the table, its lattice crust perfectly woven, the sweet and tart scent mingling with the aroma of roasted turkey. I felt a small spark of pride, a tiny piece of the woman I used to be. That spark was instantly extinguished when my son-in-law, Brian, let out a loud, derisive laugh that cut through the cheerful chatter. "Well, look at that," he announced to the table, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "I guess she can still do something useful besides take up space and run up the heating bill." The laughter around the table died abruptly. I saw my daughter Sarah quickly look down at her plate, her cheeks flushing with either shame or embarrassment, I couldn't tell which. The air grew thick and uncomfortable. I forced a tight, thin smile onto my face, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes, and reached for the pie server. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what you would have done in my situation. My fingers tightened around the cool metal handle of the pie server. I willed my hand to stop trembling, focusing all my energy on making a clean, perfect slice. The room was so quiet I could hear the gentle squish of the apples as the server cut through them. That's when my 7-year-old grandson Liam, who was sitting right next to me, pointed a small, innocent finger at my wrist. "Grandma," he asked, his voice loud in the hush, "what's that purple mark on your arm?" My heart stuttered to a stop. I had tried to hide the yellowish-purple bruise with the long sleeve of my cardigan, but it had peeked out when I reached forward. Before I could form a single word, Brian answered for me, his tone casual and dismissive. "Oh, that's nothing, buddy," he said, waving a hand. "Grandma's skin is like old paper. She bruises easy if you just look at her the wrong way. It's no big deal." He shot me a look that was anything but casual, a silent warning to stay quiet. I saw Sarah flinch, but she remained silent, a traitor to her own mother by her inaction. I simply nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and continued cutting the pie, each slice feeling like a cut into my own dignity. My mind flashed back to just 2 nights earlier, the source of the bruise that now captivated my grandson's attention. I had been putting away the dinner dishes when Brian stormed into the kitchen, his face dark with anger. "The bank called again, Eleanor," he had snapped, slamming a cupboard door so hard the glasses inside rattled. "They said you still haven't signed that account management authorization form. What is wrong with you? Are you so senile you can't follow a simple instruction?" I had tried to explain that I wanted my own lawyer to look it over first, that the language seemed to give him too much control. But he didn't want to listen. He stepped too close, invading my space, the smell of his cologne making me feel sick. "Just sign the damn paper," he had yelled, and when I took a step back he grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard, and shoved me roughly against the edge of the counter. The sharp pain had taken my breath away. "You live under my roof, you follow my rules," he had hissed before storming out. That account management authorization was, in reality, a document that would have given him full access to drain my savings and pension. The bruise was the physical proof of his coercion, a dark badge of his bullying that I now had to hide from the world. The financial troubles had started subtly a few months ago. My pension check, which had always been deposited directly into my account like clockwork on the 3rd of every month, suddenly stopped appearing. When I mentioned it, Brian had taken over, saying he would handle it, and that it was probably just a government delay. But after the second missed payment, a deep unease settled in my stomach. I waited for a day when both Brian and Sarah were out, and I called the bank from my bedroom, using my old address book to find the number. The customer service representative was very polite but confused. "Mrs. Evans, according to our records, that payment was withdrawn in cash at our Main Street branch on the day it was deposited," she explained. I felt the blood drain from my face. "But that's impossible," I whispered. "I wasn't even at the bank that day." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then she said something that chilled me to the bone. "The withdrawal was made by someone presenting identification as your designated financial caretaker." I only knew one person who had ever claimed that role: Brian. He had not only been stealing from me, but he had also created a fake identity to do it. I hung up the phone, my entire body shaking with a mixture of terror and white-hot rage. This wasn't just casual cruelty anymore. This was a calculated, criminal act. I stumbled to my small writing desk, the one Arthur had built for me decades ago. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath stacks of old stationery and photo albums, was a thick, legal-sized folder. My husband, a meticulous and cautious man, had always kept all our important documents together. The house deed, our marriage certificate, his will, and copies of all our financial records. He used to say, "Ellie, always know where your papers are. They are the map of your life." My trembling hands pulled open the drawer. It was empty. The folder was gone. I rifled through the other drawers, a panicked, desperate energy taking over, but I knew it was futile. The folder was gone. Brian or Sarah had taken it, removing the very map of my life, the documents that proved my ownership and my history. They were systematically erasing me, piece by piece, and I had been letting it happen. But no more. The shock of the empty drawer was a cold splash of water. The fear began to harden into something else, something steely and determined. The discovery of the missing folder felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I sank into the chair at my desk, the empty drawer a yawning void that symbolized the erosion of my entire life. Arthur's careful records, the proof of our shared history, were gone. This was beyond stealing money. This was an attempt to erase my very identity, to make me a ghost in my own home. The initial panic slowly subsided, replaced by a cold, clear resolve that settled deep in my bones. I was not just a victim, I was a witness. And a witness needs evidence. I stood up, my legs feeling steadier than they had in months, and went to my nightstand. I pulled out a simple college-ruled notebook I used for grocery lists. This would no longer be for shopping. I opened it to the first clean page. At the top, I wrote the date and a single stark sentence. The folder is gone. This was the beginning of my own record, my counter-narrative to the story Brian was trying to write for me. I would document everything. The next violation came just a few days later. I went to put on my wedding ring, a simple gold band I had worn for 42 years, a constant, comforting weight on my finger. It was not in its small porcelain dish on my dresser. A cold dread washed over me. I searched my entire room, my bathroom, retracing my steps from the previous day, but I knew. I just knew. I found Brian and Sarah in the living room. "My wedding ring is missing," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Sarah's eyes immediately filled with guilty tears, but it was Brian who spoke. "We had to pawn it, Eleanor," he said, his tone exasperated, as if I were a child who had broken a toy. "We needed to cover some bills. My business hit a slow patch. You live here, you eat our food, you need to contribute. Don't make this ugly." He made it sound so reasonable, so necessary. But the look on Sarah's face, the way she couldn't meet my eyes, told the real story. This wasn't about bills. It was a test, another step to see how much they could take from me. I simply nodded, turned, and walked back to my room. I didn't cry. I opened my notebook and wrote down the date and the words. Wedding ring. Pawned. Don't make this ugly. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark, the emptiness on my left hand feeling like a fresh wound. The house was quiet, but my mind was screaming. The stolen pension, the missing folder, the pawned ring. It was a pattern of systematic destruction. They were treating me like a resource to be mined until I was empty. But I was not empty. A fire I hadn't felt in years was kindling inside me. Arthur hadn't married a pushover, he'd married a fighter. I got out of bed, turned on my small lamp, and opened my notebook again. I started from the beginning, writing down every suspicious incident I could remember over the past year. The lost mail, the times Brian had helped me with online banking, the increasing comments about my forgetfulness. I wrote down dates, amounts, and their exact words. The notebook became my anchor, a tangible record of my sanity in a world they were trying to make me believe was crumbling. By the time the sun began to rise, I had filled several pages. I was no longer just a victim keeping a diary. I was an investigator building a case. The next morning, I put on my best coat and told Sarah I was going for a walk to the park. Instead, I went directly to the main branch of my bank. I asked to speak to the manager privately. A kind-faced woman named Linda Chen ushered me into her office. I didn't cry or waver. I laid it out calmly and clearly. The missing pension withdrawals, the forged identification, my concerns about financial exploitation. I showed her my notebook, the careful entries a testament to my clear mind. Miss Chen listened intently, her expression growing increasingly serious. "This is very concerning, Mrs. Evans," she said. She typed on her computer, pulling up my account. Her eyes widened. There have been 3 large cash withdrawals in the last 2 months, all requiring secondary verification, which seems to have been bypassed. She looked at me. We can put a security hold on your account immediately. No transactions without you being present with 2 forms of ID. And we can change your statements to be sent to a secure digital mailbox or a post office box, not your home address. It was the first victory, a small fortress of protection built around what was left of my life. Fortified by the bank manager's help, I knew I needed more. I needed their voices, their own words condemning them. I remembered my old smartphone, tucked away in a drawer after I'd gotten a simpler model. Could still take video. That evening, before Brian and Sarah were due home, I positioned the phone on the top of the kitchen refrigerator, angled slightly down towards the table. I camouflaged it behind a large box of cereal. It was a risk, but a necessary one. My heart pounded as I heard their key in the lock. I busied myself at the sink, pretending to wash dishes. They came in, talking loudly, and sat at the table with a bottle of wine. And then I heard it. Brian's voice, clear and confident. Once she finally signs that trust transfer document the lawyer drafted, we can list the property. This house is a goldmine. We'll be set. Sarah's quieter voice replied, Are you sure? It feels so fast. Brian laughed. She's clueless, Sarah. She won't even know what happened. I stood at the sink, my back to them, the water running over my motionless hands, and I knew I had them. The clueless old woman had just become their biggest problem. Later that night, when the house was steeped in a false peace, I retrieved the phone from its hiding place. My hands were steady as I navigated to the video file. In the dark of my room, the small screen illuminated my face as I watched the entire scene play back. Brian's voice was crisp and cruel, every word a nail in the coffin of our familial trust. She's clueless, Sarah. She won't even know what happened. The confirmation was both devastating and empowering. This wasn't just my word against his. This was his own arrogance, captured for posterity. I connected the phone to my ancient laptop, the one they never bothered with, and saved the file. I then copied it onto a small, unmarked flash drive I had found in Arthur's old office supplies. For a label, I used a permanent marker and wrote a single, innocuous word: recipes. I slid the drive into the very back of my underwear drawer, a place no one would ever look. This small piece of plastic was now my most powerful weapon, a silent witness that could speak volumes in a courtroom. With the video secured, I began to assemble my arsenal. I went back to the bank and got printed copies of my last 6 months of statements, the ones Miss Chin had flagged with the unauthorized withdrawals clearly highlighted in yellow. The sight of my dwindling savings systematically looted filled me with a fresh wave of anger. I also printed out the notes from my journal, typing them up neatly to make them look more official and easier to read. That night, I gathered everything: the printed bank statements, the typed timeline of events, and the precious recipes flash drive. I placed them all inside a simple black zipper folder, the kind a student might use for a school project. It was unassuming, but to me it felt heavier than lead. I looked at the calendar. Thanksgiving was just a week away. They would all be there, gathered in my daughter's home, feeling safe and superior. It was the perfect stage for a reckoning. The plan was set. The phone rang 2 days later. It was Sarah, her voice strained with fake cheer. Mom, you're still coming for Thanksgiving, right? I'm making the turkey the way you like it. I closed my eyes for a moment, gathering my strength. Then I made my voice sound sweet and slightly frail, the way they expected me to be. Of course I'm coming, darling, I cooed. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I'll bring my famous apple cranberry pie for dessert. I could almost hear her sigh of relief through the phone. She was so relieved that I was still playing my part, the harmless, grateful grandmother. She had no idea that I wouldn't just be bringing dessert. I would be serving the truth, and it would be a more bitter dish than anyone at that table could possibly imagine. After I hung up, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. The trap was baited. On Thanksgiving Day, I dressed carefully in a soft blue dress, something that made me look gentle and non-threatening. I placed the pie, perfectly baked, into a carrier, and I tucked the black zipper folder discreetly into a large tote bag. When I arrived at their doorstep, the air was crisp and filled with the smell of burning leaves from a neighbor's yard. Brian answered the door, his face splitting into a wide, fake smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Well, look who it is. Good to see you, Mom. He leaned in for a theatrical hug, and as he did, he sniffed the air loudly. Smells like sugar and regret in here. The insult was casual, meant to chip away at me before I even stepped inside. But this time it bounced right off. I met his gaze and gave him a serene smile. Mostly sugar, Brian, I said calmly, walking past him into the house. I hope you have a sweet tooth today. The dining room was a picture of festive perfection. The long table was set with Sarah's best china, a centerpiece of gourds and autumn leaves running down its center. Family members I hadn't seen in months were there, laughing and chatting. They were all wearing masks just like Brian and Sarah. Masks of familial warmth hiding a core of complicity or willful ignorance. I took my assigned seat, a quiet spot near the end of the table, and carefully placed my tote bag on the floor between my feet. I could feel the solid shape of the folder inside. Throughout the meal I stayed quiet, observing. I folded my napkin into a precise rectangle, then unfolded it and folded it again. Every burst of laughter, every clink of a fork against a plate, felt sharp and significant. I was an observer in my own life, gathering my strength for the moment the performance would end and the truth would have its turn to speak. The meal progressed through the traditional courses, each one punctuated by hollow laughter and forced conversation. I played my part perfectly, the quiet, elderly mother, nodding and smiling at the appropriate moments. Then, as the dessert plates were being cleared to make way for my pie, Brian stood up, tapping his wine glass with a spoon. The room quieted, all attention turning to him. I'd like to propose a toast, he announced, a smug grin plastered on his face. He raised his glass, his eyes scanning the table before landing on me with a look of pure condescension. To family, he said, his voice oozing false sincerity. And to family who finally understands their place and contributes what they can. A few nervous titters traveled around the table. My daughter Sarah let out a strained, breathy laugh, her eyes darting towards me and then quickly away. I felt every pair of eyes on me waiting for my reaction. I slowly picked up my own water glass, raised it just an inch and met Brian's gaze. Cheers to that, I said, my voice clear and steady, not a trace of the weakness he expected to hear. The clink of my glass against the others was a small, defiant sound. The tension from the toast still hung thick in the air as I began to cut the pie. Brian watched me, that familiar, contemptuous look back on his face. He couldn't let it go. He had to have the last word, the final humiliation. He turned to me fully, his voice loud enough for the entire table to hear. So, Eleanor, he began, drawing out my name. Now that we've seen you can bake a pie, tell us. What's it really like to go through life contributing nothing but desserts? Must be a pretty simple existence. This time the silence that followed was absolute and deeply uncomfortable. No one laughed. No one even moved. They all just stared, some at him, some at me, horrified or embarrassed. This was the moment. The boiling point had been reached. I set the pie server down carefully on the platter, the clink of metal on ceramic unnaturally loud. I took a slow, deliberate breath, my heart not racing but beating with a powerful, steady rhythm. I could feel the weight of the black folder pressing against my ankle from within the tote bag. This was the calm I had been waiting for, the eye of the storm. All the fear, the anger, the sleepless nights had crystallized into this single focused moment. I looked directly at Brian, my expression not one of hurt but of cool assessment. Brian, I said, my voice soft but carrying to every corner of the dead silent room. You're so focused on slicing this pie, you seem to have forgotten to slice the truth along with the turkey. A confused murmur rippled through the family. Brian's smug smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion and then annoyance. What are you babbling about now, old woman? He sneered, but the confidence in his voice was cracking. He was starting to sense that the script had been flipped, that he was no longer in control of this narrative. Without breaking eye contact, I slowly bent down and reached into my tote bag. The sound of the zipper cutting through the tense silence was as sharp and decisive as a gunshot. Zip. Every head turned toward me. Brian's eyes narrowed, his bravado beginning to waver as he saw the serious, determined look on my face. What is that? He asked, his tone dripping with derision, trying to regain the upper hand. Did you bring your own dessert toppings? A little extra sugar for your sad little life. I pulled the black folder out and placed it on the table in front of me, right next to the beautiful, untouched pie. I rested my hand on its cover. No, Brian, I said, my voice firm and clear. This isn't a topping. This is the main course. This is a taste of honesty, and I have a feeling you're going to find it very hard to swallow. I opened the folder. The first thing I revealed was the stack of bank statements. I didn't throw them. I fanned them out neatly on the table like a dealer revealing a winning hand. The yellow highlighter marks glared under the dining room lights. These, I began, my voice project NG to everyone present, are records of every single unauthorized withdrawal from my pension and savings account over the last 6 months. I pointed a steady finger at one of the highlighted lines. Each one of these transactions was signed for by you, Brian, using a forged document that identified you as my financial caretaker. His face, which had been flushed with anger, now drained of all color, leaving a pale, waxy mask. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The room was frozen, a tableau of shock and dawning understanding. The illusion of the perfect family was shattering right there in the dining room, and I was the one holding the hammer. Before Brian could form a denial, I reached into the folder and pulled out a small black remote control for the living room television. I had synced it with the flash drive earlier that morning. But perhaps you'd like to explain this yourself, I said calmly. I pressed play. The large flat-screen TV mounted on the far wall flickered to life. There in high definition was Brian's own face, larger than life. His voice, clear and unmistakable, filled the stunned silence of the dining room. Once she finally signs that trust transfer document the lawyer drafted, we can list the property. This house is a goldmine. We'll be set. The camera angle from the phone on the fridge showed Sarah sitting across from him, her face visible, not stopping him. The video played on, capturing his final, damning words. She's clueless, Sarah. She won't even know what happened. I paused the video, freezing his smug expression on the screen for everyone to see. The clueless old woman had just presented her first piece of evidence. A collective, sharp gasp erupted around the table. Forks clattered onto plates. My daughter, Sarah, let out a choked cry, her hands flying to her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of horror and betrayal. You recorded us, she stammered, her voice trembling with shock and accusation. In our own home? I turned my gaze from Brian's frozen image on the screen to my daughter. I felt a pang of sorrow for the relationship we had lost, but my resolve did not break. I protected myself, Sarah, I said, my voice even and firm, carrying a weight of sadness and finality. When the people who are supposed to be your family become the threat, you find a way to document the danger. I was living in a house where my own child and her husband were plotting to steal my home. What would you have had me do? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Brian finally found his voice, exploding from his chair so violently it screeched backward against the hardwood floor. This is edited. It's a lie, he shouted, his face now a mottled red, his finger jabbing toward the television. You set me up. You senile old bat, you've lost your mind and you're trying to take me down with you. Spittle flew from his lips. He took a lurching step toward the TV as if he could physically destroy the evidence. I didn't flinch. I remained seated, my posture straight. It's not edited, Brian, I replied, my tone chillingly calm compared to his hysterics. It's time-stamped and the original file is with my attorney. But if you'd like to see more evidence, I'd be happy to show you the security footage from the bank. The manager was very cooperative. The mention of the bank manager and an attorney seemed to suck the remaining air out of his rage. He stood there, chest heaving, trapped. As if on cue, the sharp, authoritative sound of the doorbell chimed through the house, cutting through the chaotic tension. Ding dong. Ding dong. Everyone in the dining room froze, their heads swiveling toward the front hall. Sarah looked at me, her expression one of pure panic. Brian's face went from red to a sickly gray. I slowly wiped my mouth with my napkin and placed it neatly on the table. I believe that will be for me, I said. I stood and walked to the front door, my footsteps steady on the floor. I opened it to reveal 2 uniformed police officers standing on the porch. The older one spoke. Mrs. Eleanor Evans? He asked. Yes, officers, I said. Please come in. I believe you're here for my son-in-law, Brian. I gestured toward the dining room. He's just finishing his dessert. The officers stepped into the dining room, their presence bringing a terrifying finality to the scene. The family watched, utterly stunned, as the officers approached Brian. Brian Michael Kersey? The lead officer asked. Brian could only nod, his mouth agape. "We have a warrant for your arrest for multiple counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, and attempted theft." The officer began to recite the Miranda rights in a calm, professional monotone. As the words, "You have the right to remain silent," filled the room, the reality of the situation crashed down on everyone. Brian was being arrested. Thanksgiving. In front of the entire family. He started to stammer, you can't do this to me here. Not in front of everyone." One of the officers gently but firmly took his arm. I met Brian's wild, furious gaze as they began to lead him away. He was being escorted directly past the beautiful, uneaten pumpkin pie on the sideboard. "You'll regret this," he snarled at me over his shoulder. I looked him right in the eye. "No, Brian," I said quietly, just for him to hear. "For the first time in a long time, I think I'll actually sleep tonight." The front door closed with a heavy, final thud, leaving a vacuum of silence in its wake. For a long moment no one moved or spoke. The festive table, with its half-eaten meal and beautiful decorations, now looked like a staged set after a terrible play. Then a broken sound shattered the stillness. My daughter Sarah collapsed. She didn't just sit, her legs gave way and she sank to the floor, a heap of trembling misery. Great, ragged sobs racked her body. "Mom," she choked out, her voice thick with tears, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know he would go this far." She looked up at me, her face streaked with mascara, a picture of desperate pleading. I walked over and stood before her, looking down at the daughter I had raised. There was no triumph in my heart, only a profound, weary sadness. I knelt down, my knees protesting so I could be at her level. "Sarah," I said, my voice soft but unwavering. "You chose not to know. You saw the bruises. You heard the insults. You saw your wedding ring was gone. You chose to look away because it was easier than confronting the man you loved. That was your choice." The room began to empty in a stunned, shuffling exodus. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they murmured awkward goodbyes, unable to meet my eyes, desperate to escape the scene of the crime. They gathered their coats and fled into the Thanksgiving night, the image of Brian in handcuffs forever burned into their memories. I didn't try to stop them or explain further. The evidence had spoken for itself. Soon it was just Sarah still weeping on the floor and me. The house was a mess of abandoned plates and full wine glasses. I looked at the chaos and then I walked into the kitchen. I filled the kettle with water and placed it on the stove. The familiar, simple ritual of making a pot of coffee felt grounding, a return to sanity. My hands, which had trembled for months under the weight of my secret, were now perfectly steady as I measured the grounds. The storm had passed and I was still standing. The next morning, the local newspaper was delivered to my doorstep. I hadn't called them, but news, especially a scandal this juicy, has a way of traveling fast in a small town. There, on the front page of the regional section, was a headline that made me catch my breath. "Thanksgiving Sting. Elderly Mother Outsmarts Son-in-Law in Financial Exploitation Plot." The article was respectful, outlining the basic facts without using our names, referring only to a prominent local family. It mentioned the hidden recording, the forged documents, and the arrest at the family dinner. I read it slowly on my quiet porch, the cool morning air feeling clean and new. I then carefully folded the newspaper and took it inside. I didn't display it, but I didn't throw it away either. I placed it in the bottom of my keepsake box. It was not a trophy but a record. A closing of a painful, ugly chapter. Later that afternoon my phone rang. It was Detective Miller, the officer who had been assigned to the case. "Mrs. Evans," he began, his voice professional but with a hint of admiration. "I'm calling to confirm that the evidence you provided, particularly the video recording and the bank documents, was more than enough to secure multiple charges. The forged financial caretaker identification alone is a felony." He explained that the district attorney was moving forward with the case and that Brian was being held without bail due to the severity of the charges and the risk of flight. He assured me that the criminal process was now in motion. I thanked him and hung up. The law was finally working as it should, a slow but powerful machine that I had managed to set in motion from my kitchen with a hidden phone and a notebook. 3 days after Thanksgiving there was a timid knock on my door. I opened it to find Sarah standing there, her eyes puffy and downcast. She looked like a ghost of her former self. "Can I come in?" she whispered. I stepped aside and let her enter. She didn't wait for me to offer her a seat. She just started talking, the words tumbling out in a tearful torrent. "He's me, Mom. He told me we were just managing your finances to help you, that you were getting too confused. He said the trust was to protect the house from my inheritance. I was so stupid. I believed him because I wanted to." She cried, her body shaking with the force of her regret. I listened silently, letting her pour out her guilt. When she was done, I spoke. "And you used me, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You used my silence and my fear to maintain your comfortable life. You were an accomplice to your own mother's destruction, even if you didn't sign the papers yourself." The truth was a bitter medicine, but it was necessary. Sarah's visit left a heavy silence in its wake. For 2 days I pondered what to do. The desire to shut her out completely was powerful, a fortress wall built from months of betrayal. But I also remembered the little girl she used to be, and the woman she might still become if given a chance to truly atone. On the 3rd day I called her. I didn't invite her over. I met her at a neutral coffee shop. "I am willing to consider letting you back into my life," I said, my voice clear and setting firm boundaries from the start. "But it is not a gift. It is an opportunity you must earn. There will be conditions." I laid them out. She would attend weekly therapy to understand how she allowed this to happen. She would sign a legally binding restitution plan, overseen by my lawyer, to pay back every cent Brian had stolen from me with interest from her own share of their assets. And she would move into my spare bedroom not as a caretaker, but as a guest, proving her commitment to rebuilding trust. It was a harsh path, but it was the only one that led forward. To my surprise and my quiet relief, Sarah agreed to every condition without argument. The first therapy session was the hardest. I attended with her not to participate but to observe. I sat silently as she broke down in the therapist's office, finally articulating the years of manipulation and financial pressure Brian had exerted, and her own cowardice in choosing the path of least resistance. Hearing her describe the clueless narrative they had constructed about me was chilling, but it was also vindicating. The therapist was skilled, guiding her to see her own agency in the situation. When we left, Sarah was exhausted but seemed clearer. She looked at me and said, "I'm so sorry, Mom." For the first time it sounded less like a plea and more like a statement of fact. It was a small start, a single brick laid on a very long road. A week later I had an appointment with Linda Chin, the bank manager. We finalized the new ultra-secure protocols for my accounts. As I was preparing to leave, she smiled and handed me a small, elegantly wrapped box. "This is from the entire staff at the branch, Mrs. Evans," she said. Puzzled, I opened it. Inside was a simple, beautiful silver picture frame. And inside the frame was not a photo but a printed certificate. It was bordered with an official-looking seal and elegant script. It read, "Certificate of Courage. Presented to Eleanor Evans. In recognition of your vigilance and strength in preventing financial fraud and protecting your legacy. You are an inspiration." I was speechless, my eyes stinging with unexpected tears. It was a gesture of such profound respect and validation. It wasn't about revenge, it was about honor. Word of the Thanksgiving sting, as it had become known, spread through our community. I received a call from the director of the local senior center. He asked if I would be willing to speak at a special seminar on financial literacy and elder abuse prevention. My first instinct was to decline, to hide away in my newly won peace. But then I thought of the notebook, the hidden camera, the feeling of being utterly alone and powerless. I thought of how different things could have been if I had heard a story like mine sooner. I agreed. The day of the talk, the community room was packed. I stood at the podium, my notes before me, and I told my story. I didn't sensationalize it. I told it plainly, from the first missing pension check to the sound of the zipper on the folder. When I finished, I looked out at the audience and said, "Your voice is your power. Your records are your shield. Never, ever sign your silence away." The room erupted in applause that was not just polite, but thunderous, a wave of solidarity and strength. As Christmas approached, the atmosphere in my home was different. The silence was no longer heavy with dread, but contemplative. Sarah asked timidly if she could help me put up the decorations. I agreed. We unpacked the old boxes together, the familiar ornaments bringing back a flood of memories, both happy and sad. We didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable, a shared space of quiet work and tentative healing. She was careful, respectful of my space, following my lead. When we finished, the tree stood glittering in the corner, a symbol of a holiday that was not about perfection, but about perseverance. It wasn't the joyful celebration of years past, but it was real. It was a step away from the darkness of Thanksgiving and toward a fragile, hopeful light. On Christmas Day, our small table was set for two. The empty chair where Brian always sat was a stark reminder of the chasm that had torn our family apart. I looked at it for a long moment, not with hatred but with a sort of solemn acknowledgement. I had prepared a small slice of my apple cranberry pie and placed it on a saucer in front of that empty seat. Sarah noticed and gave me a questioning look. "It's not for him," I explained quietly. "It's a symbol. A reminder of the consequences of greed and the lessons we were forced to learn this year." It was my way of acknowledging the past without letting it poison the present. We ate our meal in a quiet, peaceful silence, a world away from the tense, performative holiday of the year before. The pie at the empty place setting remained untouched, a silent monument to the truth that had finally been served. In late January, I received a letter. The return address was the county jail. My hands were perfectly steady as I opened it. Brian's handwriting was sloppy, angry. The letter was full of venom. "You destroyed my life," he wrote. "You turned my wife against me and humiliated me in front of everyone. You're a bitter, vindictive old woman, and I hope you're happy with what you've done." I read it once, then set it down on the kitchen table. I felt no anger, only a distant pity. He still didn't understand. He saw himself as the victim. I took out a piece of my own stationery and wrote a brief reply. I didn't defend myself or list his crimes. I simply wrote, "You did the baking, Brian. You mixed the greed with the deception. I just served the finished pie." I mailed it the next day, closing that particular door for good. By the time the next Thanksgiving rolled around, the landscape of my life had profoundly changed. My relationship with Sarah was still a work in progress, built on honesty and new, healthy boundaries, but it was real. This year I didn't cook dinner alone. I invited neighbors, the elderly couple from next door who always waved, the young family from down the street whose kids I sometimes babysat. The house was filled with a different kind of noise. Genuine laughter, the shrieks of playing children, and the warm hum of easy conversation. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells. Sarah moved through the kitchen, helping me, her smiles now reaching her eyes. We were not the picture-perfect family from a magazine, but we were a community, a chosen family built on mutual respect rather than obligation and lies. As we all sat down to eat, I looked around the full, joyful table. I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace settle over me. The journey had been brutal, a path through betrayal and fear I would never have chosen. But on the other side, I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. I had reclaimed my voice, my home, and my dignity. I had shown my daughter that it is never too late to choose courage over compliance. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined me. They were simply part of my history, reminders of a battle I had fought and won. The love in the room that day was not the fragile, conditional love of before, but something stronger and more resilient, forged in the fires of hard truth. Now, when I look back on that fateful Thanksgiving, I see it not as an ending, but as a brutal and necessary beginning. My son-in-law called me useless, believing that my value was tied only to what I could physically contribute. He was wrong in a way he could never have imagined. My true usefulness was not in my baking but in my resilience. It was in my ability to quietly gather evidence, to plan with precision, and to face down my tormentor with a calm courage that shook his world to its foundations. Proof, I learned, is indeed like a well-made pie. It requires the right ingredients, truth, patience, and a steady hand. And it is always most effective when it is served at the perfect moment, still warm with the heat of justice, to those who believe they are safe in their deception. He thought he was silencing a feeble old woman. Instead, he awakened a force he couldn't comprehend. If you found strength in my story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with finding courage in the comments below. To listen to the next story of quiet resilience, click on the video on the screen now. Thank you for watching.